I kind of thought it was a low-budget film to begin with.
It was just like another job, except you look weird.
I had lunch with Alec Guinness, and we used to go and sort of practice the fight together, like kids fighting in the back garden.
And I was like, look at this, what's going on?
How many actors can say that they've got their own action figure? And you become friends. I just treat everybody the same.
I said, George, how do you want me to play this? He said, well, play it like they do in the movies.
Not everything's going to stay in the film.
And I was quite angry and hurt.
It was just a nightmare.
The only thing that really got me out of this house was really going and doing this convention.
And he said, I'll pay you £300. Well, doing what? He said, signing autographs. I said, are you for real?
My face was in the movie, you know. Jeremy's got a bucket on his head. What's that about?
Well, that's purely because it's Boba Fett. I can't say any more than that. It's not my fault.
Fans all over the world are generally just brilliant.
You made a slight look. I said, yes, I was waiting for lunch.
I really didn't have that driving ambition to succeed. Maybe that's where I've been going wrong.
You don't want to be classified just as an X-Wing pilot.
It's a piece of us, or it's a piece of, you know, what somebody's life is.
And I was in with the helmet on, finally stopping with George Lucas. He said, welcome aboard. It's not a big role, but I think you'll have some fun.
You kind of just go, you know, move on. You know? As the Sandtrooper says, move along.
You know, this movie, I feel like Star Wars is one of those things where a lot of people say there isn't, you know, there's nothing left to be said about Star Wars. But you found what was left to be said about Star Wars.
Sure.
Were you looking to be able to find that thing, or did it kind of find you?
No, it found me. It found me. I was teaching screenwriting, and this is about 10 years ago, and one of my students just told me he'd been in Star Wars. And I thought, well, I kind of know that film, but I don't really recognize you. And it turned out it was the back of his head that had been in Star Wars for like 5 seconds in one shot. And I got to know him better, and he turned out that he was traveling the world signing autographs because of this involvement. And
was this 10 years ago, or was this 5 years ago?
This is 10 years ago that I first met him. Wow. So that was when I first got to kind of know him, and I got to kind of get introduced into this world. And it's kind of, you know, I've made other films in the time in between, but it just felt the right time to kind of make this film.
Mm-hmm. And now, what was it about the people who were in Star Wars that weren't normally spoken of that really fascinated you and interested you? Because there are people in every movie that are not spoken of or discussed that much.
Sure. I mean, I think the films I've made before, this is what appeals to me, basically. I'm interested by people who are somewhat marginalized by pop culture or who exist on the kind of periphery of pop culture. So my last film was called Anyone Can Play Guitar, and that was a music documentary about the music scene that Radiohead came out of. Wow. And the film itself was much more skewed towards the bands who didn't make it, the bands who inspired Radiohead, the bands who were colleagues of theirs. And I just,
when they were on a Friday?
When they were on a Friday, absolutely, good knowledge. And Radiohead were in that film as well because they wanted to talk about those bands. So to me, everything's been covered. When you talk about pop culture, you've got so much content these days, everything's been covered, all the stories have been told. And I think with Star Wars, that's completely true. It's been exhaustively documented, but it's not. There's always another angle. There's always people who are seeing it from a different point of view. I mean, I didn't set out to make a film about Star Wars at all. But what interests me is this community of people who have somewhat been pulled into Star Wars, even though they were in it for a couple of days. It wasn't that significant to them at the time, and it's become significant. And to me, that's what's interesting.
And what is that like for you? Because you have this small role in the movie. It's a job. It's fun, but it becomes a defining moment of your life. And I would imagine with Star Wars, it didn't become a defining moment until a few years down the road, because Star Wars, up until like the last maybe 10 years, had sort of dips and rises in terms of popularity, right?
That's very true.
It wasn't until like the sort of return of Star Wars, when George Lucas sort of brought it all back, that it really became known as classics because of the quality of the new ones in that period of time. And then just this past year, now it's just Star Wars is an accepted sort of top tier piece of pop culture.
It's a phenomenon, yeah.
So how did it work for you when you realized that this was actually going to be a defining moment in your life?
I didn't really think of it like that, though. I thought what had happened is I hadn't really kind of told anybody that I was involved. It was really about the fact that I'd just gone on with my life. I mean, now nearly 40 years have passed. It wasn't until 2017 that I actually, not 2000, 2007.
Whoa.
Yeah, wow. It's science fiction, remember that.
Star Wars is real.
Yeah. It was 2007 before I actually got invited to do any convention. That was in Los Angeles for the 30th anniversary. And so people had managed to track me down, and people were always interested. And it was one of those things that I had originally been cast as the fixer, which was Luke's friend. And that ended up on the editing room floor, although it's on YouTube and it's on a lot of places now. And it was really, George had asked me, can you do me a favor and put this costume on here in Tunisia and play this scene with Alec Guinness? And I kind of just walked into it. I was not expecting it. It was really a last-minute thing, and it was just kind of, I could tell that George was anxious. He needed help at that moment. And I said, let's do this. That's what filmmaking is. It's about making a contribution wherever you can.
Especially that movie at that time. I mean, it's very well documented in this movie as well that movie was the budget was far lower than I think people think it was. And there was a lot of people lending a helping hand. And one of the wonderful things about the original Star Wars a lot of times is being able to see the things that are a little rough around the edges. You know, it feels like homemade filmmaking to a degree.
Well, it feels like an indie film, and it's got that quality where it makes it that much more human. And that comes across, I think, on the screen as well, where everything it just pulls itself together. All of a sudden, the team is going in the same direction.
Now, you brought your Stormtrooper helmet here. I think for those people here who may not have seen the movie, can you talk about what your role was with Alec Guinness?
I played the Sandtrooper, or the Stormtrooper, as it's known, who does these aren't the droids we're looking for. Let me see your identification. And so it's one of those moments where it is, in its own way, just become iconic in Star Wars history. And I was just very fortunate that George asked me to do it, and I got a chance to do this scene with Alec Guinness.
Now, let me ask, when you're wearing the helmet in the scene, when you go to these conventions, how do you kind of showcase yourself so that people know? Do you have a sign that says, the guy from These Aren't the Droids You're Looking For kind of thing?
Yeah, sometimes people, the promoters or anybody who's invited you along will actually have some signs, and then you get advertised or you get promoted in terms of what you've done. And it seems that These Aren't the Droids We're Looking For is such an iconic line that everybody knows it. That's kind of the handle that you use as well. And it's interesting for me because I learned so much about film and also about people from the fans. And it's kind of a pop culture thing now that has really come forward, mainly because through the internet, because a lot of it is not advertised publicly. You don't see billboards and things like that promoting these shows. It's all done by word of mouth or through fan groups. And they're enormous. I mean, there's two major fan groups, which is the 501st Legion, and they go out and they do an enormous amount of coverage for charities. They go to hospitals for sick children, and they raise enormous amounts of funds, and that money stays in the communities. And so I'm very proud of that's kind of become part of it as well. And so, again, it's become a generational thing where you have, it's like in sports, you know how you have, your dad loves the sports team, loves the baseball team or whatever, and he takes you to your first baseball game, and then you start becoming a fan of that team, and you follow that on, and now your kids become fans of that. And Star Wars has kind of got that thing where it's being handed down generation by generation.
Yeah, I think if you're an American boy, you are born with a lightsaber in your hands at this point. Jon, I have to ask, one of the things that I really loved about the film was your sort of mix of old footage from the movies and sort of recreation of what looks like old footage. A lot of times I couldn't actually tell the difference, and I'm imagining that was the point. How did you set about doing that, and when did you first get that idea that you would sort of have these recreations that looked a lot like the old footage that we've seen with George Lucas walking around on set?
Well, we knew that we weren't going to use a lot of footage from Star Wars because of licensing. And we actually, because we didn't want to get into the licensing kind of issue about it. So we have used footage from Star Wars in there, but we've messed it up a bit. We've kind of reinvented it. We've repurposed it. So all these shots that you know really well, all these scenes that you know really well, we've kind of repurposed those. So we rock them backwards and forwards, and we zoom in on the people who we're dealing with, the extras who we're dealing with and stuff, and we score it very heavily. So we wanted to kind of play about with the footage. We didn't want it to be like a straightforward documentary where someone talks and you just show whatever they're doing on screen. I thought that would be really
to find a sort of new way of telling the story so it doesn't feel like behind the scenes sort of thing where
definitely
like someone's talking and then you see that scene they're talking about or something. You definitely find very visual ways of telling the story.
Well, the other thing that I really wanted to do was the whole point of, well, not the whole point, but part of the point of this film was about showing that this great Hollywood epic, a classic Hollywood film, was filmed in North London. It was filmed in a suburb of North London with British people. And with the recreation footage, what I really wanted to capture was the mundanity of it. Was these people looking bored, basically. I mean, if you look at the poster, if you look kind of carefully, you've got the X-Wing pilot holding a sandwich, you've got Darth Vader polishing his helmet.
It's all a shot of people with their masks off.
Yeah, they've all got their masks off. You can't actually see, but that Stormtrooper is actually scratching his balls. So like that was what we were playing about with in the film. We really wanted to show the mundane to it. We wanted to kind of break it down to its DNA a bit and just show.
There's a wonderful shot that I love where it's like two people, a guy and a woman against a wall smoking a cigarette.
Yeah.
Flick it out, put the Stormtrooper hat on, go back to set. Yeah. When you watched that, did that sort of bring you back there? Is that kind of what it felt like? Whether you smoked cigarettes or not, I don't know. But just sort of there's a lot of downtime on a movie set.
You're hired as an actor, and that's your job, and you're doing your job, and so it's the conversation moves away from that, it moves back to it. And also ELSTREE Studios has an enormous history. That's where 2001 was filmed, and that was, I think, possibly one of the reasons George Lucas was interested in working there, because in the history of that period of filmmaking, 2001 was so influential on a lot of the young filmmakers. Who wanted to work with anybody who had ever worked on 2001 and have their involvement, because that was such a cutting-edge film for its time.
Well, it's the greatest movie ever made. I have no problem saying that about 2001. Yeah. Did you ever have trouble, it's you in a mask in the movie. Over the years when you told people you were in Star Wars in the scene that you were in?
I didn't do that.
You didn't? Because you knew that people would be like, yeah, okay, sure, buddy. You were in Star Wars.
I suppose you could dine out and a few drinks with it or something like that. But no, I got on with so many other things. I write screenplays, I do music and that. I was much more, I love being in the process. I love being in the moment of actually creating something. So for me to, go out and work on a short film or something like that, that's my buzz. That's, actually being in that moment, and then you move on to doing another film. I've done a few films over the years, and so I enjoy that process, to create a process and being in the process.
That's what you'll find with most of the actors who appeared in Star Wars, really, is it was something they did, and maybe they enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it. But it's other people who have turned it into something significant. And it's always interesting when you talk to them and say, how proud were you to be in Star Wars? Anthony was a known actor at the time. Anthony had lines in the film. Anthony actually had a whole part as one of Luke Skywalker's friends that got cut. So Anthony was hired as an actor. A lot of the other people who were in that film, it was just a job. And I think part of what I wanted to capture in ELSTREE 1976 was that inner conflict, that now 40 years later, they're all touring the world doing these conventions. And I wonder how proud they are.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the same thing as if a gig that I took 5 years ago or 6 years ago that lasted 2 days suddenly became one of the most iconic pieces of pop culture of all time, and everybody wanted to talk to me about it. I'd be like,
that's what the film's about. The whole point of the film, the actual premise of the film, is what happens to an ordinary life when it's tangentially linked to something of huge cultural significance. Star Wars is so big; it's got such a large following. It's in the DNA of anyone who's kind of grown up around pop culture. But that doesn't mean that it's the be-all and end-all. And it's interesting that you asked a question earlier where you asked Anthony, you actually said that you mentioned Star Wars as being a defining moment in his life. And that's a really interesting phrasing, because I think it's other people who define Star Wars who call Star Wars a defining moment in these people's lives. Anthony's got on with his life. For Anthony, that was a job, and he carried on. So
there's the moments that we define for ourselves, and then there are the moments that others define for us, be they family or the popular culture of some kind.
But there's an interesting parallel in that, that basically everyone who's involved with Star Wars at this point in that way, it's been defined for them. And how do you turn that down? I think Anthony will answer this better than me, but I think that the opportunity to travel the world and to make some money signing autographs and meet some cool people, you wouldn't turn that down. Of course. But it maybe does something to you. And I think certainly there are people within the film who struggle with that. They feel compelled to do it because you can't necessarily turn down the money. A lot of people in the film, especially the extras, they don't have a lot of money now, so they can't turn it down. But they feel kind of conflicted about those appearances.
Do you feel conflicted about it at all?
No, I don't. No, because I actually like to spend the time with the fans and go out and learn. And they've taught me a lot about myself, which is interesting. And
in what way?
Just in terms of giving me a much wider view of the world and giving me a more rounded view. And I think the other thing that happened, and Jon asked me this question when we were first doing the interviews, and I don't know if I ever answered it, actually. He said, how has Star Wars changed your life or affected your life? And I kind of had to really, I've had to really think about that. And I think one of the things how it's really affected my life is the fact it gave me an opportunity to discover my father. And that happened simply through Star Wars, or being involved in Star Wars. I was invited to the T-Bone Walker Blues Festival in East Texas, in Linden, Texas. But I was taken after, when I was going to leave, when I was going to the airport, I was taken to Shreveport, Louisiana, where we were flying from. And in there's the Municipal Hall Auditorium. And I recommend anybody and everybody who has an interest in music or an interest in Americana in that respect, take a trip to Shreveport and go and see the Municipal Hall Auditorium. This is where Elvis Presley started his career. He stood on that stage every Saturday night for $12 a night. Johnny Cash met his wife there. All of the greats, there's probably about 120 great songwriters from the country era and from not so much folk, but from that period. And also Shreveport is pretty much, this is where Leadbelly is buried in terms of the home of the blues. And my dad, I never kind of got what my dad saw in his love of country music. And so by taking that trip and going around the Municipal Hall Auditorium and seeing all these iconic people and understanding, because as a musician, I was much more interested in orchestration, I was much more interested in instruments and the performance of instruments and that side of it. And I kind of hadn't paid that much attention to lyrics. And then I started to understand being there, in that it's like a shrine, really. You have to be there to see it or appreciate it. And I then really started to understand what my dad had appreciated in that music, and it really I learned so much. But it was Star Wars, and my
Sort of brought you around the world.
Brought me all across to Shreveport, and that was the payback.
There also must be something for those that were in this movie that played a part as you did, where you were in it. A lot of people, when they're in a movie, they can't watch the movie as alone as a movie. They remember the things that were happening on that day, and it's very difficult to do that. And like you said, it may not be a defining moment for your life, but then when you start traveling around and meeting people and you see Star Wars as this sort of odd unifier, like it really brings people together. Most people at least like Star Wars enough to be happy to talk about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It must be such a weird thing to sort of suddenly be like, I mean, when you go back and watch the movie afterwards, after having met so many people that love it and come together because of it, do you have a newfound appreciation or respect for it? Are you able to take yourself out of it?
I have an enormous amount of respect for the fans and for the people involved, but also for George Lucas. This was a very difficult project to make. And this was a project that he had to fight so hard to maintain his vision. And you're a director on a project, and you have a very particular vision, and everybody's trying to tell you how to do it, or trying to tell you, no, do it this way. And he was amazing at sticking to his guns and fighting for it, and actually wanting to see it through in the way that he did. And that's always tough.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn it over to the audience for some questions. Does anyone have any questions out here?
Hi, happy post May the 4th be with you day. I wanted to know, do you find that fans are more aware of your character outside of the mask versus other industry insiders and celebrities?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
Say that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Do you find that fans are more aware of your character as an actor outside of your mask versus other celebrities and other industry insiders?
Well, nobody really knows me. I mean, in that respect, I like the anonymity where I can actually be, I can go somewhere and I have a license to busk in the London Underground, so I can go out busking, and Jon will tell you the story of how he felt about that, and so they filmed me actually busking in the London Underground. And I love to do it because as a songwriter, it's one of the best platforms you can have to rehearse your songs and practice. And also, it helped me to overcome a big fear I'd had all my life about singing, because I already had a fear of my voice, and so busking is being that that kind of way through. And I used to, when I was 17 years old, I grew up in Montreal, and I used to hitchhike down the 87 highway from Montreal to New York, and I used to busk in Washington Square Park. And I didn't play guitar in those days, I was playing flute. And it's those kind that I still like to be able to do that. So if everybody knew me from Star Wars or I was that recognizable, then they'd probably keep stopping me and saying, hey, can we get a picture or something like that? And I would never get any busking done.
It's actually really surreal when you go down and watch Anthony busking, because he's a popular busker. People stop and listen, and little kids dance around and stuff. But the amount of people who walk straight past him who are wearing Star Wars T-shirts is amazing. You just go, if only they knew, it's incredible.
Next question.
How's it going, guys? My question is, did you or any of the other actors in Star Wars find it difficult to fulfill your responsibilities of your characters while wearing all the costumes and the prosthetics and the makeup and all that?
Oh, I didn't personally. I mean, I was very lucky because I was walking, especially with playing the Sandtrooper. I was walking into a situation that was very well set up. You're pretty, as an actor in a scene, you're pretty well covered in terms of being able to everybody takes care of you. You're a little bit pampered in that respect. And so I didn't have so much trouble, but I can only imagine for the other guys who were actually had to deal with prosthetics, the hours that you have to spend in actually having to deal with the makeup and things like that. And I mean, a lot of people ask me the question, was it hot? Because we're filming in Tunisia, it's probably about 82 degrees, and those costumes get really hot. And so fortunately in Tunisia, as the wind would blow through, as soon as you take what they call the bucket off your head, you can start to cool down. But I have such admiration for the people that go out costuming now, because they spend hours in those costumes, and I know how uncomfortable and how hot they can get. And they do that for the love of it, and they do it to help raise charity money and things like that. And so I have enormous admiration for them and what they are capable of enduring.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question.
Hey guys, thanks for coming. I was wondering if there were any documentaries or fan encounters. Maybe this reminds me of a documentary I saw about a guy who caught a ball, I think, at a Red Sox game, and everyone was mad at him, and he had to change his address and just crazy stuff. Was there any fan experiences besides yours that kind of inspired you to tell a story that intertwines with the topics you are?
As in, which documentaries inspired me to make the film?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
A lot.
there's quite a lot. I mean, the main one actually is quite an obscure documentary. It's a BBC one from about 4 years ago called Fire in the Night, which is actually a film about the Piper Alpha disaster, which was an oil rig fire in the North Sea. And the film's a really beautiful film because really what it does is it tells the story of, I don't even know how many, maybe just 3 or 4 people who experienced it. And it tells you how they ended up on that oil rig, what happened on the night that the disaster happened, and how it's affected their lives. And I saw that while I was planning ELSTREE, and I realized that was something that really was a way of looking at it. And it made me realize that, and I'm not saying this is the true case, but if I treated Star Wars as a kind of point of trauma, almost, where you have these 10 different people who come from all different walks of life, they're all different people, and they all experience this one event at the same time, then you can trace how it affects their entire lives. So that was a really big influence on me, that film, definitely. Apart from that, I'm not really sure. I kind of went my own way with it. The film, I didn't have a set idea about what the film was going to be at all. I had no plan in that way. When I make documentaries, I tend to think, well, that's an interesting community, or that raises some interesting questions. And I just want to kind of immerse myself in that for a while and see what happens. So there was no big plan for the film really until all of the interviews had been done. And I found that every single interview we did kind of shaped what the film was going to become. And even while we were editing it, we would go out and shoot more stuff because we'd suddenly realize, oh, okay, the film's going in this direction. I mean, the recreations were definitely a part of that process because we suddenly realized, okay, this needs something a little bit more kinetic. And also this needs something a bit more moody. And the film itself it keeps being described as melancholy, which I'm fine with. And kind
It does have a melancholy feel.
It is.
And I think the way that you also framed some of the interviews, the compositions there and the colors that you chose, whether that was actually there or what you were doing, sort of correcting it afterwards, is sort of downbeat colors and the film itself.
What you're saying about the frame of the interviews is a really interesting one. Because I work for the British Film Institute shooting documentaries kind of as my day job. And when I first started working there, they were screaming at me, "Why are you shooting so close up?" Yeah. And I was like, well, because that's how I shoot interviews, because as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter what people are telling you in an interview. It doesn't matter what they're saying. You have to be, and I'm saying this in front of a camera, but you have to zoom right into their face. You have to show their eyes, because sometimes what they're saying is contradicted by their mannerisms, by how they're holding themselves. And you lose that the second you get into a mid-shot. And most interviews, I feel like I'm going to upset the whole crew here, but most interviews are shot in mid-shot. And mid-shot is the kind of shot for factual, you know? They can tell you a story in mid-shot, but you don't get feelings and you don't get emotions. And when I make films, I'm not very interested in facts. I'm really not. I don't really kind of care because, especially with Star Wars, I mean, every fact has been told. It's almost boring at this point. And I wasn't going to try and tell stories that had already been told. What's more interesting to me is creating a film which is about the feelings of the people who were involved in that. So it's, you know, if it becomes melancholy and bittersweet, it's because of that. And that's very much down to the framing, very much.
Well, the framing, it lends itself, the framing and the recreations lends itself to a comparison to Errol Morris, which, I mean, I don't know if that's the good thing to do at this point because he's such a godfather of documentary film. You know, it's almost cliche to use his name, but...
I mean, not to be honest, Errol Morris wasn't an influence, and this is going to sound like a really strange kind of thing to say, but it was more, there's a filmmaker called Claude Lanzmann, who made a 9-hour Holocaust documentary called Shoah, which is a really good time.
It's a phenomenal. I mean,
love that
It's a
film.
phenomenal film.
And what's amazing about that film is the way it's shot, because he's a French filmmaker interviewing people in German. So he will ask a question, and this is all on camera. He'll ask a question. The translator will translate it into German. The person will reply in German. The translator will translate it back into French, and then you'll read the subtitles on the screen.
This is why it takes 9 hours.
This is why it takes 9 hours. But the effect of doing that is after the person's given their answer and it's being translated back, they have to sit and wait. And you can see them mulling over their answer. You can see them thinking about what they've just been thinking about. And this film is breathtaking because sometimes people just burst into tears on camera. They'll have said something quite jolly, but as what they've said sinks in, they'll kind of start crying. And that was a massive influence to me in that kind of way. So that's what I'm always trying to find kind of in my interviewees.
So if you love ELSTREE 1976, go out and watch Shoah, the 9-hour
You should watch
Holocaust
Shoah anyway.
documentary.
Shoah is a landmark documentary. But
Yeah, if you like documentary film or if you're interested in history, it's just an amazing achievement.
Also people. I mean, that's the thing. Like ELSTREE is a film. People, a lot of the kind of misconception about ELSTREE 1976 is that it's a film about Star Wars, and it's not a film about Star Wars in that sense. If you like Star Wars, there's a lot in there for you. You're going to love it. But it's a film about people.
Yeah, absolutely.
At its heart.
I couldn't agree more. And as we said before, it's on iTunes now. It's the #1 documentary on iTunes currently, right?
Wow. Okay.
Congratulations. Did I say that wrong? It's in the top. Guys, so it's out now. ELSTREE 1976. Thank you so much for being here, guys.
You.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.